ask people in this room what is Buddhism, and I'm not going to, I'm too scared. But at least there's two different types of Buddhism that emerge in the world. One of those is the kind, compassionate, loving, caring, concerned with the welfares of others kind of Buddhism. The other might be the ascetic, the solitary mountain dweller who has abandoned the cares of the world. So we have this kind of tension sometimes in Buddhism. It's like, wait, am I supposed to care about things, or am I supposed to be above them? Am I supposed to care about others as a result of their karma? You know? So sometimes in our practice we kind of get these mixed messages, like one of those messy relationships that we're in. Like, should I feel this way? And I've thought about this a lot. And I think the reason is that we all have our own version of what Buddhism is. And it reflects our own personal biases, our own personal versions of practice that we see within ourselves. So compassionate people, of course, they're going to be like, oh, good, there's love and kindness in Buddhism. That's for me, right? People who are a little bit like misanthropic, be like, finally I can shut down the world, close the door, go away, and just not care about anything anymore. So in this way, we create our own Buddhisms. The other major difference, perhaps, is even I'm doing it now, and I don't want to, the split between the Theravada and the Mahayana, right? So in Theravada, there's this emphasis on personal liberation through arahantship. In Mahayana and the Himalayan traditions, there's more of the emphasis on the bodhisattva path, which has a concern for the well-being of all beings. And people make a vow to not fulfill enlightenment until all of those beings are liberated, which is going to be a long time, I have to say, because there's so much delusion in us and there's so much delusion in the world. This is a very beautiful vow, very patient vow as well. And so some people are attracted to Theravada because they like the idea of just getting out now. Some people are attracted to Mahayana because they really love the idea of helping others. And so these things can be quite black and white, but actually it's quite fuzzy. It's quite messy. Our version of our spiritual practice is a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and sometimes we'll just cherry pick some bits that appeal to us, right? Which is, of course, what other people do too, yeah? Especially with religion. And so you've kind of invited me here today to talk about, these important issues, and I suppose there's a little bit of an appeal to a religious authority, which happens. I mean, I get it all the time. It's very uncomfortable. This is something that we do, right? We have this idea that religion has a role to play in shaping the ethics and morality of our times. And I think it does. It does have a role to play. But if we're thinking about international conflicts and we're thinking about things like war, religion is a major cause for all of those wars and has been for a very long time and still is and still will be way into the future. You know which war I'm talking about, right? The war in Nigeria. 30,000 people killed in the last few years. The war in Sudan, 15,000 people killed this year. The war in civil unrest in Haiti, the war in Burkina Faso, Ukraine, and of course, Palestine. Right? But when I said, which war I'm talking about, which one were you thinking about? It's interesting. What are the causes and conditions that have led Rainbow Nam to be interested in this war, and maybe, let's face it, not so interested in those other ones, right? There's something going on there that if we can start to understand with wisdom, teaches us a lot about the nature of being, which is why I introduced that practice to you just before, to really get you to think about looking penetratively, very deeply. For some reason, the story that's coming up in my head is my mum, who I love, and she's a good person. She loves dogs. She loves dogs. Sometimes she'll have a TV dinner. She'll just sit down, pop the telly on, and she'll just eat, And so I remember there being a story on the news that I was with her, and it was about the dog festival in, I think it was Vietnam, where many dogs are killed for meat at that time. And my mum loves dogs. She was so upset. She was crying. She was so moved as she's eating her beef stir fry. Right? And there's a reason that my mother was so interested in dogs and so not so interested in the cows. And I was interested in that as well. And I'm not saying people in this room shouldn't be interested in what's going on in Palestine. I think it's really commendable, and that it's essential that we reflect on it. But as Anne said before, we're all Palestinians, we're all Israelis in our own life. We play out these roles over and over again of the tyrant and the victim, the abused and the abuser. Over and over again we play out these roles because we're still subject to greed, hatred and delusion. We have greed in our hearts, we have hatred in our hearts, we have delusion. And until we see these things very clearly, our capacity to grow as spiritual beings is hamstrung. Until we deal with these things in our own mind, our capacity to help others come out of these things is also hamstrung. And until others see these things in their own mind, they won't be able to change. And so these Buddhisms that we kind of encounter in the world, some people may say, religion shouldn't have any say in kind of political affairs. Monks shouldn't talk about wars or take sides or anything like that. Buddhists shouldn't have a say in what's going on in Palestine or Israel. These are kind of things that people throw out sometimes, and they kind of the purpose of these things is to stop people basically identifying with what's going on in those places. There's a reason for people to want to stop people caring, to stop people understanding, and to stop seeing ourselves in others, or to stop us from identifying with those things that we see in ourselves. This is why I did that 4-element contemplation, trying to get you thinking. It's a bit mixed up, actually. It's a bit messy. And one of the things that we have to be really careful of as activists is that we never replicate the things that we see in those places of conflict within ourselves or our communities. Because those people who are at war, they don't want to hear about us having fights with our family about Palestine, causing disharmony in our spiritual communities, breaking up friendships. These are people who are enduring real war. They long for peace. What if we, in a peaceful time, can't have peace with each other? What's the point of our spiritual practice? I often think about the end of the world. Do you often think about the end of the world too? Part of daily practice. Good on you. A stronger mind than mine. At that time, when the eco-crisis has reached its peak, when everything's gone Mad Max, will you keep your precepts? Will you steal food to stay alive? Will you lie to protect your loved ones? Will you kill in order to survive? I mean, in those moments, surely that's when our precepts matter most. In those moments, that's when it's hardest to maintain those precepts, that ethical conduct. And what about now, when we're in relatively good times, here in this place? How is your practice? How are you living your life? How are you living the teachings? Are you keeping your precepts? Are you being kind to others? Are you looking for harmony and speaking about unity, connection, friendship? And this is the way, I think, people in war zones would hope that people not in war zones are living. These are the things that they wish for. To have friends next to you who you care and love about, who are safe and protected. To have the ability to have disagreements with people in a way that doesn't mean that someone's going to get killed because of it. But let's just go back. Let's go back a few steps. Back to the time of the Buddha. Who thinks that the Buddha was a social reformer? Yeah? Who isn't? Who doesn't care? Very good. I appreciate your honesty. This is something that I personally struggled with. Like, there's parts of me that really wants to believe that the Buddha was a big social reformer. You know what the historical Buddha did? He basically set up what we now refer to as Buddhism, which was a community of monks, also later on nuns, lay men and lay women. I just want to acknowledge the lack of non-binariness in this schematic, and to acknowledge too that, of course, at the time of the Buddha, there were queer, trans, non-binary people, right? Can we just take a moment to acknowledge that? Why? They've always been here. And I also want to acknowledge that they faced discrimination, and that discrimination continues, unfortunately, in some ways today. And especially people who were intersex at the time of the Buddha were forbidden things like ordination, and people who were maybe what we might regard as trans, it's not very clear, were also forbidden ordination, but they were still included as part of the community. And at that time, the Buddha, he was a person who advised kings and queens, and who went out onto the battlefield sometimes and tried to intervene. He, in the area which he was able to work within his own organization, got rid of the caste system, prohibited slavery, and constantly spoke out about killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, about lying, and also about the dangers of intoxication, a whole heap of social ills. Was he able to affect the changes that he wanted to see in society? I don't know. Certainly in the area which he was working within his own community, he was able to set up structures and to encourage people to think about these things, and I suppose this had a flow-on effect. Whether he was able to go up to kings, I mean, who can go up to kings and say, stop what you're doing, change all the laws, this is how I want things to run. You know, good luck, right? Even the Buddha, good luck. You know. So creating change is hard, even if you're a Buddha. And this is why the Buddha placed a lot of emphasis on personal change, on personal growth, and personal ethical conduct, personal growth through things like meditation, investigation into your mind, and also personal liberation. And so this is something that he tried to do, was to encourage people. And he's always putting little boundaries around things. So, for example, don't kill. It's pretty clear. Did he ever come out and say war is bad? I mean, probably. He often spoke out against it. He wasn't keen on the idea of killing at all, right? He also tried to advise kings not to go to war. He pointed out the causes of why people go to war, and to the army officers, he said, you know, people in the army, you killing people, you'll go to a bad destination in your next life. He tried all the time to curtail these things from happening, but whether he was able to stop things, I don't know. Same as us, right? Like we try as hard as we can. We try to maintain our personal ethical conduct. We try to influence people, hopefully not in a hostile or a colonial or a brutal way. We try to influence people through our example, rather than telling them this is how you should be. Through our example, we try to influence them. We try to influence governments through things like protest. We try to influence individuals, and so we try to do all of these things. And whether it's useful, I don't know. One of my best teachers, Bhante Akaliko, who some of you might know, who's a friend of mine, I've known him forever, he was also an activist, animal rights activist, and he, like me, is becoming a cynical old man. And he says, I don't know that protest works. You know, nothing that I ever protested for worked. And we talked about this, and I'm kind of like, yeah, but that's not the point of protest, right? Like, you know, it might not work, but it brings people together. It shares an ethical point of view. It makes us think about our actions. It encourages others to be the best that they can be, to put down their weapons, to stop harming others. And it gives us, people who are struggling with the crushing weight of the world's problems, a sense of solidarity and support and care. And this is kind of the point of protest, right? Like, you know, this is why we gather. We gather outside empty parliamentarians' offices. You know, they're not in there. They don't care. And even when they hear us, they don't care. I've stopped traffic, I've walked across the bridge, I've been involved in sit-ins and direct actions. They didn't care at all, right? But I cared. People who are good care, right? And so, you know, did the Buddha care? I think the Buddha cared immensely. But he understood the limits of his ability to affect change at a social level. And sometimes I think maybe that's wisdom. maybe understanding the limit of what we can do helps us understand what is possible and what is not possible, which might conserve some of our energy sometimes. One of the things about activism is it's just so exhausting. Everything is always urgent. Everything is always important. And the information about the world that we have today is limitless. And it just comes to us in one bad story to the next, in a 24-hour news cycle. And our knowledge of the horrors going on in this world are amplified so much because of technology. Think about the old days, before the internet. You remember before the internet. I'm not saying you're old, but it used to take quite a lot of stuff for something to hit the news, right? And imagine those people in villages, in places around the world, even today. Do they know what's going on in Nigeria or Sudan? Do they care? For us, who know and care, we suffer because of that. We suffer this burden of knowledge and our inability to help. And it's so sad. You know, there's so many problems in this world. A beautiful Zen poem, you know, if only I could, I would wrap up all the suffering of this world in my robe. You know? And this beautiful idea of just wanting to help others and not knowing how. How can we help them? So the problem for us is just the sheer amount of information that we're getting today, and we have not evolved in the same way to be able to cope in a way that would allow us to take on the suffering of others and to help them. We haven't evolved extra limbs, you know, extra bodies, extra means of helping. You know, sure, there's a lot of different things that we do today. Like, you know, it's great we have all of this activism online and all of that kind of stuff. But on a physical level, we cannot help all of the beings that we want to help. And of course, this is when our meditation practice really comes in, when we are able to tap into the vastness of our mind, and to practice things like compassion for all living beings, love for all living beings. Like in this way, we feel like we can rise to the challenge of the sheer scale of suffering in this world. But a reminder that this is how it has always been. Whether we knew it or not, there's war everywhere. Whether we are aware or not, there's people suffering. And this is how it has always been, which is why Buddhism gets that bad rap for being so much about suffering, right? Suffering. Buddha's always saying this is suffering. And so the path of Buddhism really teaches two things. One is the cause of suffering, and the other is the escape from suffering, freedom from suffering. And so all of that stuff, like the wars in Nigeria, Sudan, Palestine, Ukraine, all of these stuff, like this is just one small part of the suffering that exists in this world at this moment. There's bullying, there's violence, there's queerphobia, there's so much stuff, right, going on. And in the Buddhist perspective, this is just a drop in the ocean. So when you kind of make an appeal to a religious authority, like a Buddhist monk, come and give me a talk, watch out, you might get some Buddhism, right? Hopefully. And one of those things is the perspective of Buddhism, which is not limited to here and now, which is much broader. And this is the kind of knowledge that the Buddha gained through his enlightenment. They're called the Tevijjas, the three enlightenment knowledges. So this is the knowledge of past lives, going back back to a beginning point which is undiscernible. There is no discernible beginning. It just goes back and back and back and back and back. The Buddha said, I looked and I couldn't see a beginning point. It just kept on going. So this is this thing about rebirth, right? If you think you've got troubles in your life, if you think there's suffering in this world, it's just a fraction, right? The real suffering is this just goes on and on and on, and we are trapped in this cycle of samsara, rebirth after rebirth after rebirth after rebirth. So much suffering, so many wars we've seen, so many heartbreaks we've had. That's the first enlightenment knowledge. The second was the cause of people arising, of beings arising and being reborn in different places, which is karma. So we have rebirth, karma, and then we have the last enlightenment knowledge, which is the knowledge of freedom and release, that is the liberation. So this is the perspective of the Buddha. This is why he taught. This is why he said, get out. Because this is the true nature of suffering. You think things are bad, just take a step back. Check out this big perspective. That's the trouble you're in. And the Buddha gave some beautiful analogies for us to think about this. We find it in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the Anamataka Samyutta, which is the discourses about unknowable beginnings. Unknowable beginnings. And the Buddha said, the amount of lives that you've lived, the bones from all of your bodies are taller than the highest mountain. The tears that you have shed for the loss of loved ones is greater than all of the tears, all of the water in the ocean. The amount of blood, some of them is quite grisly, the amount of blood that you have lost merely from being decapitated, it's quite specific, right, is greater than all the blood, all the water in the oceans. And he says, from being decapitated as a cow, from being decapitated as a buffalo, from being decapitated as a dog, from being decapitated as a bandit, as a murderer, all of these different lives, much greater. It's difficult, the Buddha says in this chapter. It's difficult to not find a being in this world who has been your mother. It's difficult to not find a being in this world who's been your brother. That means that everyone, including our enemies, we have been related to. So this is that big picture of samsara, and it's frightening. It makes you tremble. There's a sutta, so I talk a lot about suttas. Do you know what suttas are? Suttas are like the teachings of the Buddha. One teaching, one text is a sutta. And there's a sutta called the Atadanda Sutta, which means laying down the rod. Some of you might practice yoga, dandasana, yeah, where your body is straight like a rod. The rod, of course, is a brutal weapon used to beat people, right? And so you still see it in India today, the police are issued with a rod, a danda. And the Buddha always advocated for putting down the rod, laying down the arms, laying down weapons of violence, of oppression. And in this sutta that he gives, the commentary tells us that he's standing on a battlefield, a battle between his family and another group, the Sakyans and the Kosalans. These are two groups that lived in the Gangetic Plain. And they're at war. Why? Because of access to drinking water. And he stands there and he says, I looked, and this is the time he gave this sutta, and he's talking about a memory of his. I looked at the world, he says, and I saw its creatures flapping about like fish in a dried up stream. It's quite a powerful image, right? You know, have you seen those fish in those small puddles, just flapping about, flailing their bodies about? They don't have enough water or oxygen in the water to survive. And they're just flailing their bodies all over the place. And the Buddha said, this is what we are like. We are just like these little fish in this little puddle, flailing about. And he says, peril comes to those who take up arms. He sees that there's a consequence to our actions. And he says that this is the moment where he became fearful and trembled. We've all probably had a moment like this. This fear and trembling is known as samvega. Samvega, it means like kind of spiritual urgency. We've all had this, right? This is why we're here. We've all had some like, oh, fuck. This situation is messed up. I just want to get out. This is often what brings us to the spiritual path. We see just how messed up the world is. And we're like, get me out, hit the eject button. And this is what the Buddha to be experienced before he was enlightened. This samvega, this fear. And all beings tremble. All beings value their life. And this is what the Buddha saw. What is the cause of beings going to war? In another sutta which talks about two groups being arrayed for battle, although apparently not an actual battle, the reasons for going to war are because we hold certain things dear, because of our attachment. We go to war because we have greed and hatred and delusion in our hearts. The greed, the hatred, the delusion that we have, we do like to think that as Buddhists we don't have it, which is problematic. We actually do need to see it in ourselves. If you want to work on it, you've got to see it. And we've all got it, right? We might delude ourselves into thinking that we don't have it. But this is a problem. You become rather smug, spiritually smug. And you think that you're perfect. You think that you're better than them. But that same seed of greed, of hatred, of delusion that exists within us is what has grown in those others, which has led them to war. It is in us. We see it come out sometimes in less extreme ways. Many of our parents and their parents saw this come out in real ways, in war that they fought in. Who knows what kind of person you would be when war comes? Who knows? How can we judge others? It's hard, right? We condemn the actions. These are bad actions. It's so hard to know this is a bad person. It's so convenient to be able to separate people into good and bad. right? So easy. It means us and them. The reality is much more confused. The reality is much more messed up. We are much more confused. We are much more messed up. Sometimes we do good things. Sometimes we know we've done bad things. And so there's a kind of importance of not suspending judgment. I don't want you to take that message, right? The Buddha actually said, condemn things that are not worthy of praise. Condemn those unpraiseworthy actions and praise things that are worthy of praise, right? So people doing good, praise it. People doing bad, condemn it, right? But the people, and this is one of the things that I personally really struggled with in Buddhism, because like I have teachers who say, well, like, was Hitler a bad person? I'm like, yes, you know? And they ask me to inquire deeper and deeper. This is why I taught the 4 Elements meditation. It's a profound teaching about how things are conditioned, how our understanding of the world is also conditioned, how people in this world are conditioned too. You're here in this room because of all sorts of conditions. You care about Palestine because of all sorts of conditions that have brought you to this point of concern, right? Other people do not, because of all these causes and conditions. And so one of the things I really struggled with for a long time with Buddhism was this concept of not self, and I liked the good parts of it, but I really struggled with other parts of it. You know, like, well, if there's no self and everything's kind of conditioned, then that means that even people who end up with conditioning which makes them do bad things, I have to have some compassion for them because they are acting on the basis of these causes and conditions as I do, right? And in Buddhism, there's not a lot of punishment. There are consequences, don't get me wrong, there's consequences of karma. There's consequences for people like me who are monks. For example, some ancient history. At one time, the monks were squabbling, as they often do. They were squabbling, the stories tell us, about some pathetic thing to do with the latrines. And it had gotten out of hand. Anyone who's involved in community organisations will know how this happens, right? Something had gotten out of hand. And, you know, there was all this drama, there was like accusations flying here and there. And the Buddha tried to intervene. He was told to politely piss off. Eventually he threw his hands up in the air. This is the Buddha, like whatever goes and hides in the forest on the tree. The lay people decided, well, let's sort out those monks. And they just refused to feed them. Right? Smart. So there are consequences to bad behaviour, right? Another example, this is an early form of protest that still exists today. There was a lay person who accused a monk of raping his wife. And, sorry, I should have given a content warning around that. And it was a false accusation. And the Buddha, as the Buddha always does, the Buddha always inquires and asks, is this true? Is this true that this thing happened? Doesn't rely on hearsay, doesn't judge from afar, always summons the person involved and says, is this true? And the monk said, no, it's not true, actually. I did not rape this woman. And the Buddha was like, I believe you. And so then the monk said, what can we do? There's this person going around making all these false accusations, really harming the reputation of this monk and the Sangha. What can we do? And the Buddha said, you can turn over your alms bowl. So you know that people like me, we carry a bowl. People put food into our bowl. And it's regarded as a way of making merit and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so he says, turn over your alms bowl to that man, so that he cannot put food in your bowl, so that he cannot make merit by donating to the Sangha. This is a Buddha's form of protest, right? Nice, yeah? And I just make a little side note to say that people like me and other concerned monks and nuns and lay people around the world, a few years back, we did a protest during the pandemic in response to the brutal regime in Myanmar, where 40,000 people have been killed in the last 3 years by this incredibly oppressive regime who do things like use fighter jets to fire missiles at temples. And so people around the world held their alms bowl upside down as a protest. And there's this beautiful history in Buddhism of dissent. And if you ever get a chance to read the suttas, you find people complaining all the time. People pissed off at the Buddha for saying you can't eat food after midday, for the monks, you know. People complaining, it's all preserved. The dissenting voices are preserved. And at the time of the Buddhist councils, where all the teachings were written down, were rehearsed and recorded, there was people who said, I don't remember things that way, I'm just going to remember it the way I want to remember it. And that was incorporated into those teachings that were preserved. So there's always been this history of dissent. There's always been protest. But there's always been rehabilitation. So for that person who accused the monk falsely, who they turned their bowl over to, eventually he came clean and said, look, it was a lie, I did wrong. And the Buddha said, good. You have made amends by seeing and admitting your fault. This means growth in the spiritual path. When we see in ourselves faults, we understand them and we try to avoid them in the future, this means that there's been some growth. And so, this is important for us. This is important for us so that we can continue to be the best people we can in our own lives, as examples for others walking this path with us, as example for people who haven't had the benefit that we have had of good teachers, of strong, ethical people who care, who condemn violence, who oppose oppression, who oppose war, that we are so fortunate that you have had causes and conditions which allow you to contact these teachings, and that you have had the wisdom to accept them, to understand them. You're so fortunate. And there's also a history in Buddhism of calling out, of admonishing others. It's a process of mutual admonishment. You need to have permission to do it, because otherwise it can be quite violent. Can you imagine living in a community where people could just tell you what they thought about you at any time? No, thank you. But there's a history of calling out and saying this isn't right. And there's a history of mutual admonishment. But I'll finish up shortly, Em. I was looking at the clock. I wanted to talk about this because this is something that we can practice as well. And this admonishment, this is a desire to help others grow, right? It's not done lightly. It's something that we should really consider before we do it. We should probably consider this anyway, like before we judge others or condemn others, right? And it relies upon a certain series of personal reflections. Firstly, am I perfect in my physical, bodily conduct? Otherwise, this means things like, do you kill, do you steal? Like, are you out there on the street saying, don't kill, and then at home, like killing cockroaches or killing kittens or whatever? Like, we want to make sure that there's no room for hypocrisy here, right? It's really important, yeah? Like, it's so easy to condemn others, like, what if they saw us, right? So, am I pure in my bodily conduct? Am I pure in my verbal conduct? Do I lie? Do I use speech in a really divisive way to separate people from each other? Am I using my speech well? Otherwise people will say, well, look, you're always lying. Tell us about this. And do I have a mind of love without anger? Do you have anger? I do. I'm trying, but it's there, right? I'm not completely pure. And then the next things are like, do you know the Dhamma? Do you know the teachings? Do you practice it, right? And the last one is, do you know the monastic rules, the Vinaya? And so these are some qualifications, right, to think about before I judge others. How should I investigate myself, right? It sounds like a good thing to do, right? Check yourself. Check yourself first. It might be that you're already perfect. Wonderful. It might be that there's some flaw. And I don't want to say that you have to be 100% pure before you judge other actions, right? Like, I'm not saying, look, unless you're 100% perfect, you shouldn't complain about this country doing this thing. I'm not saying that. It's probably just a good thing to reflect. Who am I? Like, who are they? Like, can I see this in myself? And anyway, and then, once you've kind of checked yourself, there's 5 things that the Buddha recommends. If you're going to tell someone else, there's 5 things that the Buddha recommends you establish. The first is, I will speak at the right time, not the wrong time. Like, this is something we can all learn for all of our flatmate dramas. The right time, right? And there's all sorts of things we can think about what the right time is, but the time is getting wrong. So I'll speak at the right time, not the wrong time. I'll speak the truth, not falsehood. The truth is a very difficult thing to know, especially in war, right? Truth is a very difficult thing to know. Speak your truth. Don't speak what you know to be false. Speak your truth. I will speak what is beneficial, not what is unbeneficial. You might be able to tell people all sorts of stuff, but whether they're going to benefit from it, whether they're going to learn from it, whether they're going to make any changes to their mind from it, if it's not beneficial, they're not going to listen, they're not going to act. Save your breath. What have we got so far? Time, truth, beneficial. I will speak in a way that does not harm. I'll speak gently, not harshly. We all know that when we've done something wrong, or when someone tells us to kind of like sort yourself out, it comes across much better if people are gentle, right? We don't want to replicate verbal abuse, of harm. We respond much better when people talk to us in a way that is gentle and kind. And the last one, I'll speak with a mind of love, not hate. And this is so important. This is so important for us as activists. We must be so careful that we do not recreate in our mind the things that cause problems in the world outside. Those things have come from minds of hate, right? One drop of hate might not seem like a lot, but drop after drop after drop after drop, you see these bitter old people. They didn't start out that way. These are these people who are out there harming others in this world. They didn't start out that way. We need to protect our minds. We need to protect our minds from hate. We need to protect ourselves from becoming the people we condemn. And this is our work as spiritual people, as spiritual activists, that the kind of change that we create in the world, it starts in us. It starts in us. And we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to be able to get rid of all of that hate. But like the Buddha, we need to exercise in our lives the kind of things we want to see, where we can create change, where we have an effect. That means that it's no good us condemning violence in faraway places if we are still in our homes being violent to each other. There's no point in condemning hate in a place over there if we are mean to the bus driver. It's just a matter of scale, right? It's the same kind of mind. And this is so important. We should affect change where we can see it most, where we can act most. And unfortunately, so many activist communities, I don't need to tell you, are like places where a lot of shit goes down that ain't cool, right? There's a lot of stuff that happens that, just a matter of scaling it up, right? Just a matter of giving people in the room some weapons. You see the potential for those minds to become like that. This is what we need to watch out for ourselves. There's much more I would love to say, and I'll just finish by sharing one other thing that is a really important part of Buddhism and a really important part of the monastic path especially. And this is the idea of forgiveness. We forgive others because we're not perfect. We forgive others to give them a chance to be different people, to see them differently. And so the formula is like this, please forgive me. And I say this to you, each and every one of you, please forgive me if by my actions of body, speech or mind, if I have upset you or caused any harm in any way today, please forgive me. In Buddhism, when someone asks you for forgiveness, you should give it. And you say, I forgive you. Please forgive me too. And they say, I forgive you. And this is a beautiful way in the monastic path. Can you imagine living with people? It's like your flatmates, except you didn't choose them. We come across all sorts of people and they're so annoying and they're so painful and they're so difficult because they're all at different stages of the path. And you're so annoying and you're so difficult and you're so painful, right? And so we have this way of asking for forgiveness. And once you forgive, you don't have to forget, right? Remember, right? it's okay. You don't need to forget. But you do need to kind of give them an opportunity to be seen differently by you in the future. And this is the problems that, people post-war, when peace comes. This is the hard work that they have to do to see each other as human again, to forgive them the actions that they did. This forgiveness is not about them. This forgiveness is about you and your mind. That you won't allow grudge, resentment, hate, anger to linger in your mind. You'll let it go. And you do this because you're a spiritual person practicing letting go of defilements of hate and practicing kindness, generosity of spirit, love, compassion. And so we forgive each other, we move on. It's like starting a new episode, right? Without knowing what happened in the previous episode. You just start again. And it allows you to just cleanse away those things that prevent you from seeing that person in ways which might be different, might change. And the Buddha even forgave people who were mass murderers. And you see people in war-torn countries who have forgiven each other for the atrocities that they committed. How much more reason for people like us living in peaceful times to forgive those people around us and to practice the Buddha's teachings in a way that is real and meaningful and here and now, which is where our spirituality needs to show up. So please forgive me if I've said anything that has upset you. And I hope that this talk, which has gone on too long, will be useful now and in the future. But may you all be well, may you all be happy, may you all be free from suffering.